Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. Today we're joined by Coach Dan Noble. Dan is currently the head hockey coach and director of hockey at Upper Canada College, recently hired as a director of performance for the Ontario Hockey League's Oshawa Generals, and is owner of Noble Sports and Performance. He previously worked for 14 years at the Hill Academy as a director of athlete performance. He also coaches in the National Lacrosse League for the Halifax T-Birds. Extremely great conversation that we had with Dan today about training the developmental athlete, the contrast between the Ontario Hockey League and prep school or Upper Canada College, his experience actually coaching the game, and his work with Hockey Canada, the women's national team. It was a fantastic conversation. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Dan. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, looking at your bio here, and first of all, it's finally great to put a face to the name. Heard a lot of great things about you in the hockey world, and I know you've been around for quite a while. We both have distinguished hairlines, and guys, if you're watching this, we're both bald. But at any rate, I wanted to ask you what a typical week looks like for you right now. To give the listeners an idea, you're working at Upper Canada College. Correct?
Correct.
You're working the Ontario Hockey League, director of sports performance, athlete performance for the Oshawa Generals. You're working at Noble Sports and Performance, which is a private facility. Atop all of this, obviously, we're in the middle of a pandemic. But let's take the pandemic aside. What would a typical week look like for you in terms of this juggling act?
It's definitely a little chaotic, and it's taken some time. So, just give a little bit of background, like before, up until the pandemic hit, like basically August 2020, I was at the Hill Academy for 15 years and I walked away from, sorry, Anthony, my heater just went on. Can you hear that? Is that causing
we're all
any
good.
issues?
No, we're all good.
Okay, sorry. I'm in an old school motel here. So I think I just got sucked in about a bag of dirt here. But so, anyways, it was a pretty simple, like, in the school year, I was at school all day. And in the summer, I ran my own off-season program like you do with your guys. And that was kind of private. So I kind of had the best of both worlds of being, in the academic setting and the private setting. And, being there for 15 years, I just hit a point where I was like, I was, I'm someone that, is very, I struggle sitting still, and, I constantly am looking to, and this may sound like, I don't want to sound braggadocious, but I need to be evolving. I need to be challenged. I need to kind of feel pressure. My wife constantly asks me, was like, why do you make things harder than they have to be? And I was like, it's how I feel. I'm someone that has ADD pretty badly, so when things are chaotic, it's actually very calming for me, because it just hits on all the senses if that makes any sense. Yeah. So anyways, I had a great, time at the Hill. It defined my career, some incredible people and an amazing learning experience. But, I was probably one of the only crazy people to walk away from a job in the middle of a pandemic and, basically like have no paycheck, but I just, I was waking up every morning. I wasn't excited to go to work. I was very argumentative, with my staff and like, I don't want to say argumentative is the wrong words, but philosophically and, we were all just kind of going in a little bit of different directions, I think, and, I was just in an area where I felt like I needed more control over the things that I wanted to do. And, I've always had this vision, and I think similar to you, Anthony, as, how I want to do things. And one thing that the pandemic's been very good for me in that sense is, so I stepped away from there in August and I went totally solo into Noble Sports Performance. And, and things were like, as good as I could have asked for, like I think I built up a really good, relationships with my athletes, and they were prepared to kind of journey with me on this and stick with me. And, we trained, for the first couple months, we were in parks and garages and like, cause gyms were closed, and eventually finding, a space, in the city of Toronto, but, the one thing that kind of reaffirmed to me is that like, I'm at a point in my life where, I no longer want to kind of I'm a unique personality, and I'm not for everybody, as I say, and now I've just kind of doubled down on that and saying, I know what I do really well, and I know the environment that I need to be in to do that really well. And it just kind of come of, less about apologizing and trying to fit in other people's kind of parameters of how things should be done, and just, doing things exactly the way I want to.
There's a beauty. Not to try to cut you off, Dan, but there's a beauty. There's a beauty. I think having a bunch of different experiences certainly helps shape everybody, including obviously yourself with the teams that you worked with. There's a beauty, at least what I've found. I don't know if you agree or not, but having your own facility, we all have constraints placed on us, right?
Yeah.
But I'm fond of saying, as a private business owner, the two constraints that I have are imagination and budget. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think obviously if you're working in the National Hockey League, you're working in college hockey, you're working for a development camp, whatever it may be, there's other constraints to go with it, right? It might be a head coach. It might be a schedule. It might be there's more constraints. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that those aren't obviously very rewarding experiences. That's not what I'm suggesting, but I look at it like in the private sector a little bit through that lens. I don't know if that makes any sense or if you agree or disagree.
No. Absolutely. And that's it. There's always going to be the realities. And again, I want to be clear, like my time at the Hill, and we had a very great, parting, support each other. Yep. But it was exactly that. Like I just had these constant visions and ideas and creating, yep. And I've always put a greater value on being able to create and control yep. than economic stability and, comfort, yep. and for me, that's just always been very important. So, once I found that balance, and I think I was always scared, I think why I didn't make the full jump sooner, I was scared, the Hill was very comfortable in the sense that if my private stuff ever fell through, yeah. I always had that salary. Right. And, yeah. and I always had support there. And I don't mean comfort in a negative way, but it was just it was hard to say, okay, why would I change this up? Things are going really well. I've got a job that people would in our field would die for. Sure, I'm surrounded by high performance athletes. And, again, I wouldn't be where I was today without that. Work with yep. incredible people. But, there was just something inside me that was just unsettled through that time. And I knew that, and there's a part of this too, where my dad passed away a few years earlier. And that was very and I know you can kind of relate to this too, yeah. but it was when my dad passed away, it unlocked something inside me where I was just man, I'm my dad was 20 years older than I am. I have 20 years. What if I have 20 years left to live? Yeah. And, yeah. And I say I pass away and, my legacy, this is my legacy right now. Yeah. This is my legacy for my family. And yeah. Is this what I have in the tank to offer this world? Have I emptied that tank? Have I become the coach, become the father, the husband, all of those things, the friend, that I can be. And I couldn't say yes, and that's where I was I needed to jump into the fire and just see what I can do, and it's been really hard because my dad passed away. Kind of my career was probably like this. And the minute my dad passed away, is kind of when things started to kind of go in an upward trajectory or have more external success. And it was always hard because even those moments when the women's team won the gold medal, Mitch Marner, is having the success he's having in this. And my dad was my coach, yep. loved hockey. And, I can never share, I had an athlete that won the Grey Cup this year. And those are moments that you just look to share, right? Yep. You want to pick up the phone and just talk, and not that it's me, that's the athletes doing the work, but those things were really hard for me. And that's where I feel now it's, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know if it's healthy or unhealthy at this point, but it's become a little bit of an addiction to chase the uncomfortableness, to just figure out what exactly I can do in this life, and what I can take and what I can withstand. And I think it helps fill that gap, that losing my dad left to me, to be honest. And I don't know if that makes sense. And
yeah, it makes, first of all, thanks very much for sharing that. We can empathize, you and I think sympathy is different than empathy. Empathy, you've walked through shoes that are similar. Sympathy, sure. You feel sorry for someone. I lost my father as well. It's actually one of the many reasons I started this podcast, just to wanted to get comfortable being uncomfortable, scale a message, grow the game of hockey. That little voice was certainly a kick in the butt from my father. So I appreciate you sharing that. That means a lot, and that's very personal. So thank you very much. I want to pivot just slightly. So you're at Upper Canada College now, correct? So if there's people in the U.S. right now that are non-Canadians, Upper Canada College sounds like college. This is a high school. This is kind of like prep school, correct? I just want to make sure I understand that. Yep. So for the listeners listening in the U.S., you're also a director of performance in the Ontario Hockey League, right? So correct. My question is, if you could compare and contrast the athletes. I know from a chronological standpoint, they're very, very similar in age, right? Almost identical in age. Obviously, game schedule is going to play a hand in this. Tell the listener how you'd attack training those individuals. Is it the same? Is it very different? How do you view the landscape of those two athletes? One being a prep school player, one being in the Ontario Hockey League.
Yeah, it's pretty. I would say it's pretty different, in the sense, so actually just to give a little context, at Upper Canada, I'm the director of hockey and also actually the head varsity coach.
Oh, wow. Great.
So I'm doing on ice at Upper Canada College, which is an interesting, and I'll give some context why that was important for me. And, it was like, again, on the idea of being uncomfortable, and this opportunity came up and, and I coach my son's team, but that's 10-year-olds. And, I always felt like, as there's always this like polarizing relationships between the training staff and coaches. Right. And I was like, and to me has always been this like ridiculous dance, where it's like, there's so much ego involved and everyone is only paying attention to their worlds, right? Like it's like, well, this is what matters to me. So this is what I'm going to tell the coach, about volumes and loads and intensity and recovery and all of this. And then this is what a coach is focused on: culture and intensity and competition and winning, and all of that stuff matters at that level. And I felt like I was getting a little bit too ivory tower-ish on the strength and performance side, where I was like, well, coaches need to do this. Well, coaches need to do this. And I really had no idea, it's, and it was easy for me to kind of say, well, my spreadsheet says you should do this, and I felt like, when this came up, it was a great opportunity to experience like what a coach is going through when they make the decisions they do, and how they evaluate, and what are the stresses they face, and because and I'll tell you, it's been an amazing learning career, or learning moment for me in my career, because
big time.
There were just so many things that like I felt myself like there was I remember there was a practice in September where, I lost my temper and I just skated the guys, for 40 minutes. And I'm like, if I was a strength coach and I saw a coach do that, I'd be like, this is ridiculous. Pointless bag skating, it's like, he's like not accomplishing anything. But like, meanwhile, what I was feeling inside, and I'm not saying it was right or wrong, but like the personal feelings of the frustrations, was in, it's just, you realize how different it is in the context.
I think it's a rarity, and I can speak. This is where I think it's real special. Number one, I think there's got to be a fusion, or there's got to be a marriage between performance and coaching. And I know we can talk about it from a communication standpoint, et cetera, but to be able to understand in terms and measures of the context of the game, the technical, the tactical abilities. I'm fond of saying, like, and I say this really respectfully of strength coaches. I am a strength coach, but it's a lot easier teaching someone how to squat than it is looking at the technical and tactical elements of the game, perhaps fixing a technical aspect, understanding the pedagogy, understanding what's a 2-1-2, what's a trap, those elements. To me, if you're able to have a very high understanding and acumen of the coaching side, and you're able to understand stressing an athlete in the weight room, you're way ahead of the game for most in the performance field. Do you agree with that?
100%. And that's where I think it's actually been, and then to tie that in with your question in regards to working with the generals in the OHL, it's given me a lot more context, I think, in working with those guys, and working with the things that, just sitting with coaches and understanding what they're looking for. But I agree. I think it's just been invaluable. And it's also been, just a lot of fun, and just making me love the game of hockey a little bit more and but it's been a really good experience. But to your question about the differences in the OHL, what you get is you get a lot of the early adapters. Like these kids have done a ton of hockey, right? Yep. And in prep, you have more of late bloomers, sure. and parents probably that were a little bit more balanced, a little bit, I'll say, sure. in their approach, probably multi-sport athletes, yep. kids, like I have kids that like play football and hockey, or baseball and hockey. Yep. But like are incredible hockey players, so like I have, probably 4 guys on our team that could play in the OHL right now. But then I also have some guys that this will probably be the end of their hockey careers. Sure. Right. So it's also an interesting thing of like, how do you manage a group where you have, maybe 5 players that will go on to play after high school, yep. And you have other players that are there for the experience. Right. And so how do you manage that and making sure that the commitment is there and everyone has the dream, but the reality is you got some very differences in Austin. Upper Canada College is one of the best academic institutions in the world. Yep. So you have to take into the schooling effect and the stress that causes. And I think that's been a really good, again, just of understanding like not just the physical stress, but the emotional and the personal stress on that's been, magnified and just packed in like a powder keg with COVID, right? And being going online, offline, all of that too, right? So where the OHL is, those guys have one goal, they're all trying to get to the NHL and, it's a business, like I think we've had, in the last month, we've had 10 transactions where there's trade cuts, releases, and, it's, it's a weird thing. You go to the gym one day and one of your favorite players is just gone, his stall's empty and somebody else is there. And I think, that's been an interesting because, again, you can relate to this, that always like, when I work in the team setting, it's been Hockey Canada is very different because they're on the program. But, normally my summer athletes, they're choosing to come to me. They're coming from a bunch of different yep. teams and there's no cutting, there's no pressure. Like it's, they're there to work hard and it's on them for how much they want to put into it. And they trust me and I trust them. And it's a very cohesive relationship. But in the OHL, when a coach calls you into his office and he's like, who's not working hard? Who's working hard? Who's a problem right now? Like and like, that's been I'm a very relational coach. Mm-hmm. And that's been a hard thing for me to like, okay, like how do I manage that communication to a coach, sure. How do without throwing somebody under the bus or, knowing that somebody can get cut because of feedback that I give a coach. And that's been just the business and like, they are there to win. Like that is it, and it's not like college, like you're there, like you can be gone at any moment, and so that is probably the biggest difference where, and like, again, back at UCC, like I can't cut, like, I can cut a kid in the season, but like, the amount of, it would take a lot for that to happen. And then I'm also probably having to answer to a lot of parents and board and all the other stuff that comes with it. I pick the team as we go into it, but it is, that's probably more similar to a college type setting, yep. And, so where the OHL is just, it is a different beast on its own, man. It's a machine. Pertaining to more
communicating with coaches in the Ontario Hockey League, I would imagine the game schedule is considerably different. UCC, what is the typical game schedule? We talking 30, 40 games or am I?
So we play 50 games usually.
Okay. Wow.
And, a lot of that is on weekends and traveling. So it's a lot of tournaments and showcases, right? So, yep. We'll go into, like this weekend we'll play 3 games, right? So, but a lot of practice. It's very similar to college in that sense. A lot of practice and training. And then, 1 game to 2 games a week, but always usually typically on the weekends.
When you're communicating, we'll talk now about the OHL level. What are your anchors? What's important that you're measuring during the season and how do you communicate it? And I want to frame something. I don't know if it's fair or unfair because you please push back on me and agree to disagree. But I hear this a lot, at least in the sport of hockey, if there is no such thing as the in-season, it's strength. And to me, again, I have a biased I look at longitudinal numbers from our own populations, longitudinal numbers from our Ohio AAA Blue Jackets, U18, U16 teams. These guys play a miniature National Hockey League schedule, 60 plus games. They're on the ice when we calculate it, strength and conditioning, games and practices over 180 touch points during the season, which works out to one active day every day. I look at longitudinal data that we've collected over the years from things like vertical jumping, body fat, body comp, upper body power. And we're seeing in some cases, a body comp has gotten worse as the season progresses, like literally whether it's cortisol, but just maybe, and then marginal gains on other outputs. In other words, like I always say, compete versus complement, right? Like we're trying to complement the game schedule, not compete. So do I think it's bad if players get weaker during the season? Of course, I want everyone to maintain their strength, but it's a juggling act, and the game's going to win out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's I'm with you on that. So early on, I was like intensity all the time, right? Like, whether it was the volume was lower, but it was still like, hey, like, we're going to train every day. We're going to do this, and I've really and again, people may argue and disagree with me on this, but to me, hockey is how much of a skill sport it is really under, maybe not taken into account enough.
Sure.
And that what makes, for example, what makes Mitch Marner? Is it that he can squat, I don't know, X amount of weight, or he can generate this amount of force, or is it his skill and his IQ?
Sure.
Right. And so when are we processing at our best? When are we able to utilize our skill at our best? Yep. What are the things that affect skill and IQ? Fatigue, sure. Right? So to me, I've really taken a step back for the in-season I'm talking about, is that to me, it's about managing fatigue.
Yes.
And that I've got guys in Oshawa that are literally 150 pounds. And, coaches want, hey, this guy's got to get stronger. I'm like, absolutely does, but I'm like, the marginal gains that we're going to gain, and then how we get those marginal gains and the possible impacts it can have on their fatigue levels and their skill set. I don't know if the risk is worth the reward.
The unintended consequences, right?
That's
Delayed
it,
onset
right?
muscle soreness. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
And again, so for an average day in the OHL, right? These players, so they either have 2 to 3 games, so they could have a 3-and-3 Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or they could have a game, Friday and Sunday, or Saturday and Sunday. Right. And so, which is great, but it also gives that opportunity. So they show up at the rink at 9 a.m., they train at 10, then they're on the ice at 1, and, then they got video and film, and they're there from 9 to 4. Right. In that. And to me, again, I don't think people take us just not being home 9 to 4. That's physical and mental and emotional stress of just it's a job, just like when someone goes to work and even though they may not do a lot that day, still sitting in a chair is just it takes its toll on you, right? Whether it's where you want to be or not. And the stress of constantly being evaluated every single day, being called into the coach's office and all of that. And, the stress of losing parents, agents, the microcosm of those 2 years, 3 years in the NHL, and is just, it's unlike anything I think that exists in sports, is because of every single day, those kids feel like they're living and dying on the outcomes of that day. And I try to work with them to not see that you can't live like that.
Yep.
But it's just, it's the culture, it's the nature of the beast to a point. But, so for me with training with those guys, I have to be very specific of what am I trying to accomplish? Right. So I want to make sure they're available as much as possible. Right. So paying attention to hip health, soft tissue stuff, spine, spine health, low back, rotation, thoracic mobility, shoulders, all of those things, and wrists, I don't think so. Guys that I think look at the amount of hockey players whose wrists, they can't even do a push-up anymore because their wrists are so jammed up. And so, or are arthritic or they have, tendinopathies or whatever it is. It's just, the game has changed how many pucks these kids have shot in by the time they've gotten to that point. And so again, my training has to, like having those kids jump in and start doing hang cleans and other stuff that you may do in other sports. It doesn't make sense, And so to me, it's trying to understand where I need to individualize for those groups, understand what do I need from, a movement and, functional perspective, and I know the word functional can get you bastardized or whatever, but to me, it's just like, what are the movements I need to train that are necessary for the sport, that need to be prepared to handle high amounts of stress. Yep. And then what are the movements I need to train in order to maintain strength and power, yep, and output. Right. And then it's like, how can I marry those together? And so, and then, I also look in the coordination piece in there too. Like I think coordination in hockey is massive, right? And so how can we build in coordination work and invest in that athleticism piece on a daily basis, which you're not going to do as much because you just don't have as much bandwidth. Yep. But I still think whether it's forms of jumping, rolling, skipping, crawling, like I think all of that stuff can get worked in on a daily, but even if it's for 2 minutes of just, again, to keep investing in that, because the amount of times like players will cut, it's very interesting watching the players come in from NHL teams and even OHL teams. Is, some guys come in and they just look like that, they're all hunched over and one shoulder's jacked up on one side and, you don't get
healthy.
Hips.
You don't get healthy playing sport. If you want to get healthy, sit and don't do much. You get inherently unhealthy from orthopedic standpoint playing sport.
No, absolutely. And so, and then you see other players that come in and they look really good. They look like they kind of look like when they, and so it's like, what are the things that were done in order to help those athletes kind of maintain some sort of balance, right? Because you're not going to, you play, an 82 game schedule plus playoffs, there's going to be imbalances. There's going to be working through stress. There's going to be it is what it is. Right. But, to me, those are the things of how can I get the biggest bang for my buck and make sure that my players are healthy, and that I'm not taking away from what they do best from the skill component.
I like it. So we talked about this idea that, development versus managing, in this case, in season managing stress. What do you look for either at Upper Canada College or in the Ontario Hockey League? Or do you physically or objectively measure external load, internal load? Is it trim scores? Is it GPS? Or is it just simply a sessional RPE and we track that over time, a smiley face or a frown, and we're just asking guys how you feel? I know those can all be, done on a different budget, but what is it that you measure, if you don't mind us asking, if you're able to answer that? And then how do you communicate that to a coaching staff?
Yeah. So we'll do, I'll do with Oshawa. I'll kind of speak to that. I think they're different. I would treat the two different when I measure. Sure. Oshawa, we'll use force plates and we'll jump, when we try to jump. I don't have them do it once a week. I think again, the amount of assessment sometimes can be over top, so, but I will have them do a daily, kind of questionnaire, which, and again, and I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of questionnaires, but I feel like those kids don't have a huge voice. And so I've tried to create my questionnaire where it gives them a little bit of a voice, and asking different questions like, what's your confidence level right now? Do you find yourself stressed and anxious? Are you enjoying playing the game, on a level 1 to 5, and then obviously the basic questions of soreness and nagging injuries and things like that. But to me, it's for the questionnaire piece, and I'll get on the force play second. I kind of want to look into where can I engage with this? Where can I learn some information where I can just pull that athlete aside in the gym, hey, what's going on? And just because, again, I think there's a massive, and I think this is sport in general for high level youth sport, is the mental health piece is it's an epidemic. I would tell you, you got your guys that don't give a crap and they're fine, and no matter what happens, and they'll roll. But then you have guys that are hanging on by a thread, that aren't sleeping, that are checking their stats on a regular basis, checking Twitter, what people are saying about them, talking to their scouts every day. Mom and dad are are up and down them for their play. And, and I truly believe that confidence and joy are probably two of the most critical pieces, to drive performance. So if you're not enjoying what you're doing, it's hard to be good at it, right? If you're not confident in what you're doing, it's hard to be good at it. And I'm not saying that I can accomplish that, but sometimes I can go back and try to say, well, where's that coming from? What's driving that, and do I need to drive this person to a mental performance coach? Do I need to talk to the coach about them? Do I need to maybe touch base with the agent, or is it just a simple conversation of just letting them get some stuff off their chest, so that personal piece is something where I'm really kind of going down a rabbit hole on right now of just trying to understand stress in general. And the impacts that it has on performance. And then we look at it from our jumps. We do, a counter movement jump, we do a squat jump, and we do a rebound jump. And, what I look for in those jumps, I'm looking for big fluctuations in weight, one. And
so you're using that as your scale too. Brilliant, right?
I mean, for sure. Because, asking kids to weigh in, I look at the weigh-in board and it's completely different than what it's saying on why it's,
absolutely.
So,
beautiful.
And it's a simple, a simple piece of looking at. If a kid's lost 14 pounds since the beginning of the season, there's something going on, right? So, and then braking force is a big one too. You're just looking at to me, yes, obviously, ideally, guys are getting a little bit stronger. The output's going up, and but I find for the most part that's staying about the same, or maybe dropping a little bit. But it's just gonna kind of do its little dance from the beginning of the season to the end. Obviously, we're looking for if there's a massive drop off or massive shifts, and again, that's anytime there's a big peak or big valley, that's a conversation that needs to happen. But I think to me, the braking force piece, like for hockey in general, when they've lost, and actually Ryan Smith has been really good at me, and we've breaking that down of just understanding when hockey players are fatigued, that's the biggest area what's showing is because sometimes their force output will still be the same, but then all of a sudden the braking force is the biggest difference, right? And that's the piece. And then I find that also as well on the ice, that affects their ability to have a little bit more jump and change the direction. And, and that's the piece I'll take and show the coaches. And just hey, we've got to back off on these guys a little bit. Maybe let's have them sleep in. If we've got an evening game, no morning skate, let them sleep in. Let's let them have a good breakfast, and we'll, let them come to the arena for 1 o'clock. Sorry, that was a lot. I didn't mean to go into too much there.
I think it's fantastic. How do you communicate, and it might be your programming, it might be your metrics. How do you communicate, or have you found a difference? I mean, I know you and I are Gen X. I know now the millennial athlete. Do they thrive, at least at the OHL level and a UCC, with a technology point, or is it just more about having those conversations that you alluded to before, where you're looking at questionnaires and you want to take a guy out for a coffee? What are they thriving more towards nowadays? I'm guessing with all the Twitter and Instagram and everything else, there's more of a tech aspect, but I could be wrong. Obviously, every locker room's different.
It's funny because now, I mean, even force plates 5 years ago, barely anybody had them, right? Now everybody kind of has them, the accessibility piece. And so you pull them out and kids are like, oh, I jump on these in the summer. I do this, and they know their numbers, and they know, we've transitioned from knowing that I have putting chalk on a wall and knowing your vertical jump from doing it on a wall to, kids knowing that their force outputs and that their left and right may have some differences in the asymmetries, right? So I find that there's, especially in there's a difference. I want to see how I can say this. The current 16-year-old is very different than the current 25-year-old. The current 25-year-old, I think, was on the shoulder of the technology revolution within, I don't know if revolution is the right word, but, the emergence of technology within professional sport, and I think they dealt with the influences of the older athletes that were don't you jump on those plates, that's going to give an opportunity for a coach to see, and that's going to come back and bite you in the ass in contract negotiations. Don't put that GPS on your back. And so they are oh, so some of them are they're like, I don't want it, like I'm not dealing with it. And then some of them are more open to it, but like, depending on who the leaders on that team are. But then the 16 to 18-year-olds right now are very into the technology piece. They want to know their data. They want to know their numbers. Yep. They're like putting a GPS monitor on their back is like, it's not even an argument. It's just like click, where you put a GPS on a 35-year-old, they're like taking that thing. As soon as you turn your back, it's coming out and going back in the locker. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think, definitely for that, I guess these guys are Gen Y, right? Coming up, and so but definitely the technology, but there's also, I think we have to be careful because they're so obsessed to a point with the data that we have to be careful how much we give them and that we just don't pollute them because they become obsessed on it. Like, and that's one thing I'll say is like, they're so results driven. They're so like, extrinsically motivated by this stuff that they become obsessed on the wrong things and can get lost in that. So I think it's on us to really manage how much we're showing and how we paint that picture of where the data fits in with everything.
No doubt, which leads me to my next question, which is kind of off the cuff, but it leads, where are you right now, your opinion, with this pendulum swing in technology? Are we way off? Have we reached an equilibrium? Are we way off on one side of the tangent in terms of this technology era? I'm fond of saying at times, I feel like, I think it certainly serves a time. I think it certainly serves a purpose. I think measuring and being objective is fantastic if we're measuring the right things. I also think that there's a lot of show and tell, and there's more show than tell in terms and measures of how are you applying that? How does it make your job easier? And how are you disseminating that to the coaches for them to be able to apply it and then tangibly use it, as opposed to just A, showing a piece of technology, and B, here's, go to it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Where are you in that conversation? How do you feel on that as a coaching staff in the sport of hockey specifically?
So, it's interesting, like, two of the smartest guys I know, one being like, Vern Gambetta's, I would say he defined my career in terms of just like, he's been a mentor, father figure to me in a lot of different ways. And, he has very strong opinions on the states of technology. And I think he's rubbed off on me a lot in terms of like anything new and emerging, he like filters that stuff with like, maybe sometimes too fine of a comb, but like, he's very just like, skeptical of everything, but it's been good for me as a younger coach at the time to be questioning and not rely on the technology piece. I also came up with the hill. I had to build my own equipment, build my own gym, move constantly, lack of, makeshift dumbbells, makeshift benches and squat, so I never came up relying on fancy equipment or facilities. Right. So, but then I look at a guy like Matt Jordan, who's also like a great friend of mine and a brilliant, like to me, one of the most brilliant guys in the world. And, watching how he uses technology and watches how he's got, and then he'll go like, it means nothing, it's like, I was doing all this, and this, and what did it tell me? I don't know, and then how but like how simple, how brilliantly simple he'll make his, what he really measures and takes into account what drives him and how he constantly questions his own self, and that is, you'll rarely see Matt, but like, check out my spreadsheets or check out my reports or things like that. Like, it's more of like, well, what does this mean? Well, what does this mean now? What does this mean? And I really respect that about him, because I get really, I'll be honest here, and I don't want to go into stuff, but like, I get really frustrated like that. I think no one takes pride in being a coach anymore. Everyone wants to be a sports scientist or like, performance scientist or director of performance. And I was like, all of those roles are absolutely pointless if you don't have someone that can actually teach or coach or create a difference, and I don't think we have enough coaches anymore. I don't think we have enough, like I'm watching these guys get crowned as like speed gurus. And I was like, how the fuck does every strength coach not know how to teach that? You know what I mean? Like, this guy's not a speed guru. He's just teaching basic sprint mechanics. Like, like, shouldn't we all know that? Like, shouldn't, like, and if you don't know that, and I apologize for my language, but I get a little fired up on that side of things, is that like, we should all know how to teach sprinting. We should all know how to teach, strength training. And like, I don't do a lot of Olympic lifting, but I can teach it as good as anybody,
Sure.
like it may be obviously not like the guys, but like I can teach it as good as anybody to do what I need to do with it. Like, movement and rolling and LTAD stuff. And like, whatever you want to look at, I just find that there's been this, everyone is just, it's this arms race of like, how much technology can you use? How fancy are your spreadsheets? And then I'm like, okay, but like, are you making people better? And like, how many games does this guy miss? And are you actually dressing? Like, is he getting better as a sport? And 90% of the time it's not, but yet the problem is like, and I'll stop here in a second with this, but like, this is something that just, again, fired. You have these guys that like are like, sell themselves on social media, and you have we have more and more and more young strength coaches coming up, and they're all paying for their courses, and they don't even know what they're paying for anymore. And they're registering and doing these courses with these guys on sports science when this guy's never even worked in a team setting before to actually, apply any of these actual things that he's trying to sell to people. So yeah. I guess and I'll let you kind of jump in here at this, but like, my piece is that like, technology absolutely matters. Measuring and having, baselines and being able to manage the health of your athletes, throughout the season in order to keep them in the game, because that's always look like if it's not helping us keep our athletes in the game and playing, yep. then it's not useless. It's useless yep. to me, if it's not driving what we're doing that day, and again, it's useless to me. But yep. I think that we had probably a little bit more of probably a over exaggeration, or like, we committed probably a little too early on some of the sports science stuff. And now I think there's been a kind of a pendulum shift back towards the middle. I think what Adam Douglas and his team is doing in Montreal first year, I think Adam has a really good understanding with the Canadians, yep. that Adam understands the value of having a really good strength coach on the floor. And Adam knows his role of yep. now is to kind of put all those pieces together and facilitate. Right. Sure. And that's what there's a difference. And that's like, and this goes into whole kind of leaderships and teams and all of that stuff, and understanding roles and responsibilities, but just understanding like, for example, like I use Ryan Smith, like Ryan gets all my data all summer, and mm-hmm. I don't input that. Ryan takes it, he gives it to me, and I'm like, perfect. That's what I need to go. Like, I'm not going to waste well,
there's a time
I don't know
element,
how to
right?
code. Yeah. Right. I know what I do well, and I need to be on the floor with my guys and connecting. And if I'm driving home, I'll call them and I'll talk to them if I see, and that's where I invest, because that's my skill set. Right. And other people that code and do that other stuff, it's awesome. I'm not like, that's a role too, but it's a piece. But to me, how does it all come together, and who's bringing it together, and what does it mean to the athlete, And
so true. Very, very, I very great answer, a very in-depth answer. I think, like I said, I'd echo your comments in terms of, I think it's very important. I think it's important to objectify. I also think, and we've talked about this on other podcasts, I think perhaps at least with the physical inputs, those are, I say, low-hanging fruit. Those are much more easy to measure, right? A vertical mm-hmm. jump, a bench press. The hardest stuff to measure is what really matters, right? Which is the scoreboard. Yeah. And those are really, start from the scoreboard and work backwards. I think there's certainly merit with external workloads, internal workloads. How does that athlete tax? But we also have to remember that there's just a million working parts. The puzzle's never put back together. That's one element of a 24-hour day. Yeah. So 100%. It's just, there's a lot of, I think, 4 or 5, as Dan Pfaff would say, anchor points. What really matters? Start from the scoreboard, work backwards, track those, and then be able to communicate those simply with athletes and with key decision makers. When I say communicate those, in my opinion, this is where probably I bias myself. You and I spoke earlier in the podcast. You're coaching right now. Like, to me, that's a rarity, but it shouldn't be a rarity. You understand the game. You understand what it entails based on the workload from practices, based on the technical and tactical. Everything else is numbers. If you have context with those numbers, that is a really, really, really good blueprint on measuring and managing. And I think you got to have those two married. It can't be just a person locked in a room looking at, you got to have some context with those numbers. So interesting.
And one piece just to add to that, I think is, because I'm always cautious of being the guy that's like the coaching guy or the science guy. It's really, to me, it's always dependent,
Yep.
on what your athletes have been exposed to. And I think this lockdown, right? So I had my group of the women, about 12 players from the women's national team, when Worlds got canceled, we basically trained straight for almost 18 months. Right.
Yep.
And Hockey Canada does a phenomenal job of tracking data and from years and years and years, right? Like they have historical data on all of their athletes from these girls since they were 16 years old. And so when I looked at them, when they came to me, I saw a lot of type A personalities, knew their date, you got to understand, the female athlete as well, for the most part, not always, but very just organized, responsible, they work their ass off. Those, you want to look at what a professional athlete looks like and how they carry themselves and how they eat. It's those women do it. But where I looked at is well, these women work their ass off. They're stronger than half the men I train. They move amazing. What can I bring to them? Right. How can I make them better? Yeah. And to me, I tracked less, to be honest. And it was more of a personal piece. And that I had a lot of girls that had gotten cut from previous teams, and that had, I don't like using the trauma word, but had experienced high amounts of anxiety around that. Yeah. And in the training piece, I had aging athletes that were worried that their careers were over, and so I took it upon myself of making this really about almost a periodization of people, of an understanding of giving them things to read, and the way I talked to them, the words I used, the way I poured into them, the encouragement, the factors of not letting them obsess on the data, right? Because they were they get evaluated so hard. They're what about my jumps? What about my jumps? What about my jumps? And I was hey, the jumps will take care of itself. Right now, we need to get you moving without pain, right? And it's and at the end of the day, it was hey, it was an awesome job. And we did this and honestly, this was probably one of the most powerful moments in my career, is the day before they left for World Championships. And I don't tell this in again, to kind of pump my own tires, because it was therapeutic for me, as going through the, through that COVID lockdown as much as anyone. But, I had and there was males that actually was Marner was there, and a couple other NHLers were there too. And that was a really cool piece, that the NHLers training with those women shoulder to shoulder and just pushing each other. It was a beautiful, kind of over that, 12 to 18 month period. But I gave each athlete a word and a quote, and they all had the same quote, but they each had a different word or phrase that when I saw them, that's what I saw or felt. And so I gave them all blank, had them stand in a circle, and I gave them the sheet upside down. And I had them go, as a group, they would flip the sheet over and they'd read that word or statement, and they'd read the quote. And the quote was, embrace the fear of failure. But then the word and statement was different for each athlete. And it was just to remind them of their value, right? Of how they see, and I just said, what, take this right now when you go into camp and put it on your wall, and just remember, no matter what happens, you get cut, you get dropped down the lineup, whatever, just remember your value. And I think it was just a powerful, pure moment where it was just athletes coming together, just remembering that they're people, and they matter, and that they have value, and that their value is never going to be dictated on where they stand or what color of a medal is around their neck. And, and just acknowledging the pressure that they feel. And that a lot of the time is again, talk to a guy like Mitch Marner, being in Toronto, there's the times your value can be connected in how you're perceived by fans and media and everything else. Right. And no, he's an amazing human being, right? He makes people's lives better every time he cleans up after himself. Last one off the ice, says hi to everybody, introduces himself to everyone he meets, signs autographs for every, and just to me, I felt my job was to just remind them what good people they are, and how much they matter. And that, if sport was taken away, which it had been for 2 years, that you still have incredible value. You're going to go do amazing things in this life. And so, not to be cliched and corny here, but to me, that's what I recognized what that group of people needed during that time. Yeah. They needed somebody to be pouring into them as people, and then there's times where athletes have no clue where their training is going. They have no clue where they stand, where they need to get better, and they're stuck from a performance side. So guess what? Those guys need a little bit more numbers. They need a little bit more
So true. That's called emotional intelligence, and that's a quality that I think people consider soft skill, but I think it's a hard skill. I think really good coaches have that. I'm also fond of saying great coaches are a lot like gardeners. Gardeners don't grow flowers. They create an environment for flowers to grow. And man, really good coaches. That story, I got no hair, but I got it standing up on my bald head. That's how you create an environment. Yeah, that's a fantastic analogy, fantastic story. Not just young coaches can benefit from that, but older coaches as well. That's why people come back. They want to come back because they're positive. They come back because obviously I understand the results. I get it. But they come back because of the way you make them feel, and that's creating an environment. Pivoting here because I want to respect your time. We've got T-minus 10 minutes here, but I want to talk with you about your time, parlaying that into Hockey Canada, specifically with the women's national team. We talk about this as short-term competition windows, right? Mm-hmm. Like you're in a tournament. Yeah. This is not a full season. Yeah. You're going in for what I suggest anywhere from 10 to 12 days on a short-term competition. Does that sound about accurate, or is it a little bit longer?
Yeah, no, that's right. It's about, probably around like a 2-week period, right?
Okay.
And so, and just to give you some context how that goes. So I had the women, that 12 up until they left for camp. And then Jeremy Steinbeck takes over. He's the camp coach. So he's the director there. And then he would take them once he got in, right? And so Jeremy would check in with me on a weekly basis, where they're at, and again, talking about roles. That was Jeremy's role, managing up. They're getting better, trust, checking in, and making sure that I'm doing my job on that end.
So you would be responsible for them in Toronto where they trained, correct?
Yes.
And then the communication would go from there to Jeremy, the individual. Where, for example, if the tournament was in Finland, Jeremy would be in Finland, and you'd be speaking with them. Okay. I would imagine this to be the case, which again, we're complementing versus competing. But at that particular time in these tournaments, again, I'd imagine, we're talking 2 weeks. It's more of a managerial in terms of managing stress, dynamic warm-ups, nutrition, sleep, hygiene, et cetera. Are those things that have been communicated prior to departure? Are those items that have presentations that the coaching staff gives? Are those presentations during the 2-week tournament? How do we educate the athletes, in terms and measures of educating them on their lifestyle choices away from the rink?
Yeah. And so, just in terms of the Hockey Canada group there, like the one thing with them and why they're so different, I think, with everybody else is, one, again, Hockey Canada does a great job hiring some great people that are giving them a ton of resources and piece like that. But it's interesting. Their training volume, their training bandwidth is so much greater than the average male's bandwidth, because they train all year round, essentially. Mm-hmm. So Jeremy will have them training like right through that tournament, they're lifting, they're training, and they're sprinting, because they can handle it. You don't have to worry. Like when I get, if I get a random, new athlete, a guy that's been in the NHL for 10 years, I'll have guys that have never sprinted before, are worried that they'll pull a hamstring or pull, and so that's, I think, the biggest piece, what they're looking for is that they know what these women have done. They know what they're capable of. And that's what really drives the in-tournament stuff, because that the work has all been done, that they can handle that amount of stress, and that they're going to respond, and the stress is going to have a positive impact. Where in Oshawa, I don't know, and I'm kind of taking this question, and I apologize, in a different way, but in Oshawa, I don't know what all of ththose guys did all summer. Right. Okay. So it's like when we sprint, it's like buildups and very passive and low volume, and we don't always hit top speed, because I just don't, and I've learned the hard way that what happens when you sprint people that don't sprint regularly. But those women, they sprint well, and they run well, and they lift well, and they respond, and they're not going to get crazy sore after a lift. And so, and that's where, again, I think, but that's what they do better than everyone else. They I get from what I've seen is they eat like champions, they train like champions, they sleep like champions, and they're very concerned with, for the most part. There's a couple individuals. No, I'm just joking. Is they're probably listening to this, and but for the most part, they have a really good understanding of what makes their body drive, right? And so they've experienced what it feels like to like what happens when you eat right, sleep right, train right, recover right.
Yep.
And, you know, and you're driving on all cylinders. And I think that's probably rarer than probably most people think in a professional sport environment, you know, like where, again, like those women literally trained 6 days a week for 18 months straight, you know, with obviously your deloads in there and stuff like that. But like, and that's where like a different part, like I pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed because I just knew that I could with them. Right. Like, you know, and they got stronger, they got faster, they, you know, like, and we deloaded and other things, but like, you know, it was just like, it was probably the most enjoyable experience of my coaching career because I could just, I could experiment to a point in ways and do different things and fine tune and, you know, to like really enhance performance because there was just such a strong base that's when you could really kind of go in there and like, I wonder what would happen if we did this with you, right? Like Natalie Spooner is a great example. And so Natalie came to me. She had chronic hamstring problems.
The Ohio State University, mind you,
Columbus,
Ohio.
that's right.
The Ohio State University.
Yeah, that's right. And she'll be the first one to say it. But, you know, massive personality and incredible human being. But, you know, Natalie, when she, you know, I said when she came, she was a Clydesdale, right? It was just like bump, 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 you know, and you'd hear her running it. It would come, you know, and I was like, to me, it was like, Natalie's got great, unbelievable skill and touch around the net. And like, you know, what can I do? Like, imagine what she'd be like if I could help with her acceleration a little bit, you know, help with her change of direction a little bit. And like, and we just invested in that and getting her healthy and feeling that she could sprint. And like, she like, you know, I don't want to say, cause she's had an incredible, you know, Hall of Fame career, but, you know, she has been like, you know, she is at a point where her game's gone back to a different level, you know, and that's the cool part about that experience. Cause you don't always get to do that because one, the skill and all of the other stuff is in place, right? Like, you know, like, so she's already a world-class athlete and now I can kind of just like add some ingredients, you know, put in some salt and add some pepper and, you know, heat up and cool down and, you know, you get some pretty cool results. But, you know, and just the differences of what they all needed was just, it was just fun. Like, you know, and that was a part of COVID I loved because I didn't have anyone else I could train at the time. So it was like, our training sessions were like, you know, 2 to 3 hours a day at times, you know, like, and it wasn't like always like going, but it was a lot of conversations and just like, you know, just it was just a very fluid based program that was like, you know, I'd go home at night. I'm like, I got to change this. I can do this. I can change this. And it was just fun. Like, you know, and so I didn't answer your question at all, man. I apologize. But like, I thought, you know, that was relevant.
We're talking hockey, baby. It's an awesome conversation. I do have one last question for you.
Okay.
Obviously, we've talked about for the past hour, the developmental player, UCC, OHL, like the young women on the Canadian national team. So looking back now, what would your best advice that you would give to an up and coming developmental player? It could be just athletic advice, personal advice, looking down through the rear view now. What advice would you give a player?
Well, from a physical standpoint, sprint. Sprint. Like, you know, like I think the things I've seen is like, you know, even if I take a 12-year-old right now, like I would say you just sprint twice a week, you know, sprint, that's all you need to do. And then you go play your sport and have fun and be a kid, you know, rolling, gymnastics, you know, handstands, like, you know, to me, if you look at some of the greatest athletes in all professional sports are ones that have the biggest toolbox. They're not the fastest. They're not the strongest. They don't jump the highest, but they can do everything, you know, fairly well. Right. Sure. And so they're adaptable movers, you know? And so, you know, I love to see our athletes be able to roll and pop up and go into a lunge and just, you know, really explore movement variability piece. You know, I really think you need to be cautious of the structured, regimented strength training programs. Not always the case. I know there's some kids that thrive on it, but parents, I think, will get caught in that trap where they're like, my kid loves it. And I'm sure he does, right? He loves it too, because you also, when he comes out of there sweating, you give him a big hug and you go get ice cream after, and he loves the response that he gets from doing those things. But what I always say to parents right now is that, like, if he's still in this in 5 years from now, he's going to have to do this at a higher level, and it's going to become a job. And I'm like, you don't want to have this to be a job at 12 years old, 13 years old. This needs to be fun, and invest in his athleticism, invest in the things that in those developmental I am a believer to a point in developmental windows and training windows. And I think those things matter. I think, rebound jumps and spring and again, like I said, the sprinting piece and flexibility, mobility, I think all of that stuff should be heavily invested in at a young age. But I think having kids on periodized plans and squatting under a bar, and like, I'm not saying they shouldn't do it or can't do it or never do it, but I'm like, if it's not investing in their passion for the game, if it's not investing in their passion for moving, if it's not investing into their overall joy and health as just being a healthy human being, that's probably 5 to 10% of what I would do with a young athlete. To me, like when I want athletes to come in, it's very games based. It's fun. It's learning. It's got some structure to it, but at the time it's a very, like, I want them to walk out and like, that was really fun. So then when that kid turns 14 or he goes through that, that time comes, whenever it is, then he gets under the bar. He's like, and I find that you want to leave something in the tank that can be, that you can achieve, because too many kids right now are peaking way too early. And to me, it's like, I don't want to be the best 12-year-old, 13-year-old. I want to peak at 8, I want to have room to grow at 18, 19, 20 years old. Right. So that's my 2 cents. And I think too, there's like, I love surfing and snowboarding. It's kind of like my old man passion right now. And like where, and I suck at both, but I love them, but like, there's a surfer that's named Shane Dorian. And his kid's an unbelievable surfer. And I was lucky enough, we went back and forth on Instagram DM one time he was live. And I said, like, how do you get your kid to, cause he clearly just, obviously it's Instagram, but like, you just can see a joy. There's a joy in his kid and what he's doing. There's a joy in their relationship. And he's like, I just celebrated the shit out of my kid, whatever he wanted to do, whatever the uniqueness he showed, I celebrated that and I made it matter. And to me, that was just a brilliant line of like, I always come back to my own kids of like, how can I celebrate their uniqueness on a daily basis? And remind them, just like those women and those men, is like how much value they have in this world, just as a person, and that they can do things as people that will always far outweigh anything they may be able to do as an athlete. And I just think, we all as people need to hear that. We all as people need to understand the impact that we can have and that we have an opportunity to leave this world a better place.
Our guest today has been Dan Noble. Dan, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I apologize for talking too much.